I think I didn't do anything wrong, just said the truth in a joking way, and suddenly my whole life turned upside down. It started with one careless comment about my ex and ended with official papers that shattered everything I thought I controlled. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. It started with nothing more than a joke. At least that's what I told myself over and over, even when the silence around the table told a different story. We were eating dinner on a Friday night. Isabel was humming to herself between bites of pasta, and David sat there in his usual way, quiet, focused on his plate, as if the food held more importance than the people in front of him. The silence irritated me, as it always did. I hated the way he gave nothing. No spark, no fire, just that heavy calmness that made the house feel like a museum. I wanted to stir things up, to make myself the center of attention again, so I leaned back in my chair, smirked, and said what I knew would slice through the stillness. I told him, in front of Isabel and my friend Naomi, that Marcus, my ex, knew how to please me better. I said it with a laugh, playful on the surface but edged like a knife. I thought it would be funny, that it would shake him, maybe even draw out the argument I sometimes craved. Instead, David froze for only a second, then set down his fork and folded his hands. He didn't speak. Naomi covered her mouth to hide her laughter, glancing at me as though she wasn't sure whether to join in or stay quiet. Isabel frowned, asking softly what I meant, but I waved it off, saying Mommy was only joking. I felt power in that moment. The room spun around me. My words had weight, and I was in control. David's silence unsettled me, though. He didn't glare, didn't snap, didn't rise to the bait. He just excused himself and left the table, retreating into his office with that steady calmness I despised. The click of the lock echoed, final and irritating, and I muttered that he was being dramatic. Naomi laughed again, but weaker this time, as though she wasn't sure if she wanted to stand too close to me. When Isabel asked again why Daddy had left, I told her not to worry, that he was too sensitive and couldn't take a joke. I added that some men were built differently, that some men, like Marcus, had more presence, more strength. Naomi shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable now, but I ignored it. I liked the way the words rolled out, bold and unfiltered, and I told myself that honesty was better than silence. Isabel didn't look convinced. She pushed her plate away, muttered that she wasn't hungry, and left the table without another word. After Naomi went home, I tried to draw David out of his office. I knocked on the door, saying he was taking everything too seriously. I told him it had just been a joke, that he was imagining insults where none existed. His voice came back through the door, calm and controlled, saying words mattered, especially in front of Isabel. I laughed bitterly, accusing him of being paranoid, of playing the victim. The door stayed closed. I stormed to bed alone, muttering that he was impossible. The next morning, I expected him to have thawed, to be back at the breakfast table with his usual routine. Instead, he poured Isabel's cereal, packed her school bag, and left early, kissing her on the forehead, but giving me nothing. Not a word, not a look. His silence gnawed at me more than shouting ever could. I tried to lighten the mood by telling Isabel that Daddy didn't understand humor, that he was too old-fashioned to get jokes, but she looked at me with wide, serious eyes and said she didn't like it when I laughed at him. That cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Later, at work, I retold the story to 2 co-workers in the break room, expecting them to laugh, to admire my boldness. I painted it as comedy, describing how David just sat there frozen while I cut him down with a single line. One co-worker forced a small smile, but didn't say much. The other frowned and asked why I would say something like that in front of my child. I felt heat in my chest, defensive. I told them marriages were complicated, that people needed honesty instead of sugarcoating, but their silence mirrored David's. and I walked out of the break room feeling oddly small. That evening, when David came home, I tried to needle him again. I said maybe he could take a few lessons from Marcus, since clearly my ex had been a real man. I laughed loudly, daring him to react. Isabel's fork clattered on her plate. She whispered that she didn't like it when I said things like that. David leaned down, kissed her head, and excused himself again, retreating to his office. The lock clicked. The silence in the dining room pressed against me like a wall. Isabel wouldn't look at me. I told myself again that this was power, that he was weak for hiding, that I had control, because my words shook him enough to send him away. I muttered that he was sulking, that he always acted like the victim when I told the truth. But deep down, I noticed the difference in his silence. It wasn't sulking. It was something else, something steady, something that unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Naomi texted later that night, asking if things were okay. I told her David was sulking again, that he couldn't handle reality. She replied with a single word, It was small, but it stung. Even she was pulling away. I threw my phone aside, furious, and told myself they were all wrong. I was the one being honest. I was the one who dared to say what others were too afraid to admit. As I lay in bed alone, the house dark and quiet, I told myself David's silence was proof he had no fight left. But in the back of my mind, I wondered if maybe his silence wasn't weakness at all. Maybe it was something else, something building slowly, something that would break me before I even saw it coming. The weekend after my little joke at dinner, I decided I wasn't going to let David's silence ruin my momentum. If he wanted to sulk, let him. I had friends who actually appreciated a sharp tongue and a fearless sense of humor. So I went to Naomi's apartment on Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine and the same story I'd been telling myself, that I was right, that I was bold, and that David was weak for not laughing. Naomi opened the door, smiled faintly, but I could already see hesitation in her eyes. We settled in on her couch, poured glasses, and I launched into the tale, dramatizing the way I had dropped Marcus's name at the table, the way David had frozen, the way I owned the room. Naomi gave a small laugh, but it was nervous, hollow. She asked if Isabel had been upset, and I brushed it off, telling her kids forget things quickly. But Naomi didn't let it slide. She asked why I needed to bring Marcus up at all, why I kept poking at David instead of just letting things rest. I told her it wasn't poking. It was honesty, that women were too often silenced, and I refused to be one of them. I said David needed to toughen up, that maybe if he couldn't handle words, he wasn't much of a man in the first place. Naomi shifted uncomfortably, muttering that maybe I should be careful with Isabel hearing those things. I waved her off, saying Isabel was just a child and didn't understand adult conversations. But deep down, I remembered the look on my daughter's face at the dinner table, the way her eyes had clouded. I pushed the thought aside with another sip of wine. Later that evening, Naomi's boyfriend, Michael, joined us. He asked what we were laughing about, and Naomi explained in short, careful words. Michael frowned, saying it didn't sound very funny. He asked why I'd want to embarrass my husband like that, especially in front of a friend and a child. I snapped that David embarrassed himself every day with his silence, his passivity, his lack of drive. I said sometimes a man needed a wake-up call. Michael shook his head, muttering that it sounded cruel, not funny. His reaction stung more than I wanted to admit, so I doubled down, laughing loudly and saying men always protected each other, that they couldn't handle women speaking truth. Naomi didn't argue, but she didn't laugh either. The room felt heavier, and I hated that I wasn't winning. On Sunday morning, David barely spoke. He poured Isabel her cereal, checked her homework, and left for his office without acknowledging me. I told myself he was just sulking again, but his composure unnerved me. Isabel asked quietly if Daddy was mad, and I said he was just too sensitive. She frowned, then asked why I always said Marcus's name. The question hit me like a slap. I told her sharply not to repeat that she didn't understand, but I could see in her eyes that she did, at least enough to feel the sting. That afternoon, I met a couple of co-workers at a cafe. I repeated the story once again, hoping for laughter this time, needing someone to validate me. I exaggerated, telling them David had looked like a scolded puppy, that the silence had been priceless. One of them gave a weak smile, but avoided eye contact. The other said softly that if her husband ever said something like that to her, she'd be devastated. I rolled my eyes, saying women these days were too fragile, too soft, but their lack of laughter made me feel suddenly exposed, as though the room had shifted against me. That night, when I came home, David was already putting Isabel to bed. I hovered in the doorway, listening as she whispered that she didn't like when I laughed at him. My stomach knotted, but I barged in, insisting she shouldn't take sides. David kissed her head and told her to sleep well, then walked past me without a word. I followed him to the kitchen, demanding to know what he was teaching her, accusing him of turning her against me. He simply looked at me with that same calm gaze and said nothing. His silence was infuriating. I shouted that his silence was manipulation, that he was punishing me by pretending he was above it all. He shook his head slowly, walked into his office, and locked the door again. The sound of the lock made my chest tighten with anger and fear. Over the next days, little cracks began to spread through the life I thought I controlled. Isabel's teacher called to discuss some concerning comments. She said Isabel had told her Mommy laughed at Daddy because he wasn't strong. I flushed with embarrassment, muttering that kids always repeat things out of context, but the teacher's tone was gentle and firm, making it clear she didn't accept my excuse. She said children internalize things more than parents realize. When I told David about the call, expecting him to react, he only nodded and said he was already aware. That simple answer rattled me. Naomi grew distant too. She stopped answering my texts as quickly, claiming she was busy. When I finally confronted her in person, she admitted she felt uncomfortable with the way I kept mocking David. She said it wasn't fun anymore, that it felt wrong. I accused her of betraying me, of siding with him. She just sighed and said she cared more about Isabel than my pride. Her words echoed in my head all night. Still, I refused to back down. I told myself that everyone else was overreacting, that I was the only one who understood how to keep marriage honest. I told myself that silence was weakness, that David's calmness was proof he had no fight left. But deep down, a part of me felt the shift. Naomi's fading loyalty, Isabel's frown, David's unshakable silence. It all wove together into something I couldn't quite control. And then, one evening, as I was folding laundry, I heard the faint sound of a printer running in David's office. The steady hum, the shuffle of papers being stacked neatly, it sent a chill through me. He wasn't sulking. He was preparing. The following week, David suggested we join his family for dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown. I was suspicious at first, thinking he wanted to parade our troubles in front of his parents, but I also saw an opportunity. Part of me wanted to prove I could still control the narrative, that I could win the room the way I always had. So I dressed sharply, rehearsed a few lines in my head, and walked into that restaurant ready to perform. Margaret and Robert were already seated, their eyes lighting up when they saw Isabel, but dimming noticeably when they looked at me. Michael, my brother, had also been invited, which surprised me. Naomi was there too, and I immediately felt boxed in, surrounded by witnesses who already seemed aligned with David. Dinner began stiffly, with small talk about Isabel's school and the weather. I hated the quiet, the way everyone seemed careful with their words, so I broke the silence with a story. I told the table about the night I had teased David, about how I'd said Marcus knew how to please me, and how David had frozen. I laughed as I told it, expecting at least Naomi to chuckle, maybe even Michael to smirk. But the air around the table didn't warm. Naomi looked down at her glass, her cheeks flushing. Michael frowned, his hand tightening around his fork. Margaret's expression was sharp, her eyes locked on me, as if she couldn't believe I had just said that out loud in front of everyone. David sat still, his face calm, watching quietly without a single flicker of anger or shame. I pressed on, insisting it was just humor, that honesty kept marriages alive. I said too many women lied about their satisfaction, and I wasn't going to be one of them. I framed it as bravery, as if I were some pioneer of truth, but the silence that followed was crushing. Margaret finally spoke, her voice cold but steady. She said there was a difference between honesty and cruelty, that using Marcus's name to wound her son was neither clever nor brave. It was humiliating. I rolled my eyes, saying she was biased, that mothers always defended their sons, but Michael interrupted, asking bluntly why I felt the need to tear David down in public. I snapped that David never defended himself, that he hid in silence, and someone had to speak the truth. Naomi shifted in her seat, her voice soft but clear, as she admitted she didn't find it funny either. She said she had laughed before, only because she didn't know how else to respond, but the more I repeated the story, the more it made her uneasy. My cheeks burned as I realized the laughter I had once taken as validation had been nothing more than discomfort. I snapped at her, accusing her of betrayal, saying she was choosing David over me. She replied that she wasn't choosing sides. She was just tired of hearing Isabel's father mocked like a fool. That stung in ways I didn't want to admit. Margaret leaned forward then, her voice low but cutting, saying David's silence wasn't weakness. She said silence could be strength, that dignity sometimes meant speaking less and doing more. Her words unsettled me, though I laughed them off, saying she was living in the past, clinging to old-fashioned values. But the look in her eyes told me she saw further than I wanted to believe. Dinner ended awkwardly, with everyone quiet except me. I tried to force laughter, filling the silence with more jokes, but no one responded. Isabel clung to David's arm, whispering something that made him smile faintly. Michael excused himself early. Naomi followed shortly after, and Margaret stood to hug her son tightly, whispering something into his ear before leaving with Robert. I walked out of that restaurant furious, insisting they had all ganged up on me. David held Isabel's hand, calm as ever, saying nothing. His silence pressed against me like a wall I couldn't climb. At home that night, I confronted him in the kitchen. I demanded to know if he had orchestrated the dinner to embarrass me. He said nothing, just looked at me with steady eyes, his silence more infuriating than words. I shouted that he was manipulating everyone, turning my friends and family against me. He only turned away, carrying Isabel upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my anger. The next day, Michael called. He said he had been thinking about what happened at dinner, and he told me plainly that I was out of line. He said he loved me, but couldn't defend me anymore if I kept mocking David. I tried to twist his words, accusing him of siding with my husband, but he said it wasn't about sides. It was about respect. His voice was firm, final. When the call ended, I threw my phone across the room, shaking with rage. That week at work, I tried to retell the story again, desperate for someone to laugh. I needed to reclaim control, to feel that power of being the one who dared to say the unsayable. But even my co-workers looked at me differently now. One told me gently that I was hurting myself more than David, that mocking your husband wasn't bold, it was cruel. The words replayed in my head all day, though I refused to accept them. Back at home, Isabel grew quieter around me. She asked more often to sleep in David's room, clinging to him while avoiding my gaze. One night I overheard her whisper that she didn't like it when I laughed at Daddy, that it made her feel bad inside. I wanted to storm in and scold her, but something stopped me. Instead, I stood in the hallway, listening to David comfort her with gentle words I couldn't hear clearly. The sound of their closeness made me feel like an intruder in my own home. Still, I told myself David's silence meant nothing. I told myself he was weak, that he would never have the courage to act. But the image of Margaret's sharp eyes, Naomi's quiet confession, and Michael's firm words haunted me. They were all lining up behind him, not me. And David, the man I had called spineless for years, was holding all of them in silence, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't break apart. One evening, after putting Isabel to bed, David walked into his office and closed the door. This time, I crept closer, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard faint murmurs, the clicking of a keyboard, the shuffle of papers. It was organized, deliberate. He wasn't sulking. He was building something, piece by piece, behind that locked door. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt a chill of fear. Because whatever he was building, I knew it was meant for me. By the time another week had passed, the cracks in my control were beginning to show everywhere. I had always believed my words could bend the narrative, that if I told a story loudly enough, people would believe me. But the echoes of that dinner at the restaurant clung to me like smoke, seeping into every corner of my life. At the office, when I tried again to retell the "Marcus knew how to please me" line, as if it were daring comedy, the room didn't laugh the way I expected. My co-worker Melissa gave me a flat look and asked if I realized how humiliating that must have been for David. Another co-worker simply excused himself and left the break room. Their reactions cut me in ways I didn't want to admit. I tried to laugh it off, saying people were too uptight, that nobody could take a joke anymore, but my voice sounded forced even to me. The more I repeated it, the less powerful I felt. When I came home that evening, David was already reading with Isabel on the couch. They looked peaceful, the soft glow of the lamp around them making it feel like I was walking into a world I didn't belong in. I told myself to reclaim space, to make my presence known. I sat down and teased David again, saying he could probably learn a thing or two from Marcus about pleasing a woman. I said it loudly, making sure Isabel heard, as if to stamp my authority back into the room. Isabel's face crumpled, and she pulled closer to her father. David didn't look at me. He kissed her hair, closed the book, and guided her upstairs to bed. The silence he left behind was suffocating. The next morning, I received a call from Isabel's teacher again. She said Isabel had told her classmates that Daddy was weak because Mommy always laughed at him. My chest burned as I tried to explain that Isabel was just exaggerating, but the teacher's voice was calm and firm. She said children don't invent these things. They repeat what they live with. I ended the call quickly, pacing the kitchen with my heart hammering. I felt trapped, cornered by my own words. I tried to turn to Naomi, desperate for reassurance, but she had grown colder. She listened quietly as I ranted about David's silence, about Margaret's constant interference, about Michael siding with him. When I finished, she sighed and said maybe it was time I stopped joking about Marcus. Her tone wasn't mocking. It was tired, as though she no longer had the energy to defend me. I snapped, accusing her of betrayal again, but she shook her head and said she cared about Isabel more than my pride. Her words stung because they echoed what the teacher had said. Everyone was suddenly acting like my daughter was the fragile one, not me. That evening, Margaret stopped by unannounced. She sat at the table with her back straight, her expression sharp, and asked if I realized what I was doing to Isabel. I tried to dismiss her, saying this was between David and me, but she cut me off. She said children see more than we think, and that Isabel's sadness was obvious to everyone. She said David's silence wasn't weakness, but patience, and that patience eventually runs out. I told her she was meddling, but her eyes never wavered. Before she left, she looked at me and said, David would not stay still forever. The words sank like a stone into my chest. Later that night, I overheard David on the phone in his office. His voice was low, but I caught words like petition, custody, and documentation. My heart lurched. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear more, but he moved further inside, his voice muffled. The sound of the printer started again, papers sliding neatly onto a tray, and the weight of what he was doing hit me. He wasn't sulking. He wasn't hiding. He was preparing. I stormed into the office, ignoring the locked door by banging until he opened it. When he did, his face was calm, his expression unreadable. I demanded to know if he was planning something behind my back. He didn't confirm or deny, only asked me if I really thought words didn't matter. I shouted that it was just a joke, that he was paranoid, that everyone was turning against me because he was manipulating them. He said quietly that no one needed his manipulation, that my own words had done the work for him. Then he shut the door again, and the lock clicked with finality. The following days blurred together, each one pressing me tighter into a corner. Isabel avoided me, choosing to sit by her father during meals, whispering to him when she thought I couldn't hear. Naomi stopped responding to my messages altogether. Michael sent me a short text, saying he couldn't defend me anymore. Even at work, the whispers seemed to follow me. People weren't laughing with me. They were watching me. My own stories had turned into chains. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone, I saw an email from a legal office addressed to David. The subject line read, "Custody consultation follow-up." My stomach dropped. I confronted him immediately, waving the phone in his face, shouting that he was tearing the family apart. He looked at me steadily and said it wasn't him doing the tearing. He said he had given me every chance to stop, every opportunity to see what my words were doing, and I had refused. His calmness infuriated me, but beneath the rage, I felt a flicker of panic I couldn't silence. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while David worked late in his office. I heard the printer hum again, the soft shuffle of papers, the faint ring of a phone call. My chest tightened with every sound. For years, I had called him weak, spineless, too quiet to matter. But now, in the heavy silence of our house, I realized his quiet wasn't weakness. It was something far more dangerous. It was preparation. And as I listened to that steady rhythm of machines and murmured conversations, I understood the truth. David was no longer enduring my words. He was building something with them, piece by piece, and when he was finished, I wouldn't recognize the life I had once controlled. The papers arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. A man in a suit knocked at the door, asked for me by name, and handed me an envelope before walking away without a word. My hands trembled as I tore it open, and the sight of the stamped seal nearly stopped my breath. Custody petition, financial protections, documented evidence of emotional harm. Words like pattern of verbal humiliation, impact on minor child, and testimonies attached screamed up at me from the pages. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to tell myself it was nothing but theatre. But as I scanned the lines, the weight of signatures and dates and legal jargon pressed down on me until my knees felt weak. When David came home that evening, I waved the papers in his face, shouting that he had turned our marriage into a battlefield. Isabel watched from the stairs, her eyes wide and worried. David didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself the way I wanted him to. He simply said that Isabel deserved peace. His calmness made my chest ache with rage. I accused him of trying to steal my daughter from me, of poisoning everyone against me, of plotting in silence while pretending to be the victim. He only shook his head and said the truth had been enough. The next day, I stormed to Naomi's apartment, desperate for someone to tell me I was right. I begged her to confirm that it had all been harmless, that I hadn't really done anything wrong. But Naomi's face was pale and serious. She said she had already spoken with David's lawyer, that she had told them everything about the dinners, the laughter, the way I repeated the Marcus story again and again. I gasped, calling her a traitor, but she stood firm. She said she couldn't lie, not with Isabel in the middle. She said my daughter's face at the table that night had haunted her more than any loyalty to me. I left her apartment shaking with rage, muttering to myself that David had brainwashed even my closest friend. At work, whispers followed me. A co-worker pulled me aside to say she had been contacted for a statement, that she'd told the truth about the break room conversation where I had bragged about owning David. She said she felt guilty, but couldn't lie under oath. My world was collapsing in places I thought I controlled. Everywhere I turned, the walls of silence were now speaking, and their voices were louder than mine. The pre-hearing meeting with the lawyers was worse than any nightmare. I walked into the polished office with my chin high, pretending I wasn't afraid, but when David's lawyer began to speak, my confidence withered. He presented a timeline so precise, it felt like a noose tightening. He cited the dinner where I first said Marcus's name, Naomi's statement confirming it, Margaret's letter describing her son's quiet suffering, and Michael's reluctant admission that he had witnessed my cruelty more than once. Each piece landed like a hammer. Then he introduced Isabel's teacher's report, detailing how my daughter had repeated phrases like, "Daddy is weak," and "Marcus was better." The words made my stomach flip. My own child had become a witness, her innocent honesty twisted into proof against me. I tried to object, shouting that children exaggerate, but the lawyer's calm reply cut me down. Children repeat what they hear. My own lawyer scrambled to argue that it was all exaggeration, that I'd meant nothing by my jokes, that David was blowing things out of proportion. He leaned on intent, saying my remarks were careless but not malicious. But the other lawyer's response was chilling. Intent does not erase impact. The phrase echoed in my head long after the meeting ended. That night, I confronted David in the kitchen again, desperate to break through his armor of silence. I told him we could still fix things, that Isabel needed both parents, that he didn't have to go through with this. His eyes softened only slightly, and he asked me why I only said those words after receiving the papers. I stumbled, claiming it was because I loved him, but even I could hear how hollow it sounded. He told me calmly that it wasn't about love anymore. It was about respect, and that was gone. The following days were filled with dread. Margaret sent Isabel a new dress for the hearing, writing in her card that she was proud of her son for standing tall. Michael stopped returning my calls. Naomi didn't answer the door when I showed up. Even Isabel avoided me, clinging to her father at night, whispering things I couldn't hear, but that made him smile faintly. I had become the outsider in my own family, watching from the shadows as David slowly, methodically gathered everyone to his side. I tried one last tactic, cornering him at his office door, begging him to reconsider. I told him this wasn't justice, it was revenge. He looked at me steadily and said revenge would be shouting, fighting, destroying. What he was doing, he said, was protection. For Isabel, for himself, even for me. His words struck me harder than any insult. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to raise his hands. He had already won by being patient, by letting me dig the pit myself with my own words. The night before court, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the printer humming in his office, the quiet murmur of his voice on the phone with his lawyer. Each sound was another nail hammered into the coffin of the life I had once controlled. For years, I had mocked him as weak, spineless, too quiet to matter. But in that silence, he had been building something unstoppable, and as I lay there, powerless, I realized that tomorrow his silence would roar louder than any of my jokes. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of sterile air that made breathing feel tight. I walked in with my lawyer at my side, my chin tilted upward, rehearsing the lines I had repeated all night. It was just a joke. It was nothing serious. Everyone was overreacting. I believed if I said it enough, someone would finally believe me. David was already seated, his suit pressed, his posture calm. He didn't look at me when I entered, didn't acknowledge me at all. That indifference burned worse than open hatred. Isabel wasn't in the room, but I knew her presence lingered in every folder and statement stacked neatly on the table in front of him. The judge opened with a dry summary, listing our names, our marriage length, Isabel's age, and the allegations of emotional harm. My stomach clenched at the word allegations. because even though I still told myself this was an exaggeration, the pile of documents made it feel like my fate was already sealed. David's lawyer rose, his voice calm and steady, laying out the evidence like stepping stones across a river. Each stone was one of my words, preserved in ink, testimony, or recording. First came Naomi's statement. It described in detail the evening at our dinner table, how I had laughed while comparing David to Marcus, how Isabel had asked questions and looked confused, how David had sat silently, enduring it. Naomi's words were quiet but cutting. She admitted she had laughed at first out of discomfort, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized it wasn't funny. It was cruelty. My chest tightened as the judge underlined a phrase in her testimony. Then came Margaret's letter. She described her son as dignified, patient, enduring humiliation with restraint. She said she had watched me humiliate him in front of others, using our daughter as an unwilling witness. The judge nodded slightly, her pen scratching against the paper. I wanted to shout that Margaret had always hated me, that she was biased, but my lawyer whispered for me to stay quiet. Michael's statement followed. My own brother admitted he had heard me mocking David more than once, that he had tried to defend me but could no longer justify my words. He said he worried about Isabel growing up in a house where cruelty was treated as humor. Hearing that broke something inside me. The teacher's report was next, and it was the one that landed hardest. The judge read Isabel's words aloud. I don't like it when Mommy laughs at Daddy. It makes me feel sad. I think Daddy is weak because Mommy says it. The sound of my daughter's voice captured on paper was sharper than any blade. I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing myself not to cry in front of them. I wanted to scream that Isabel didn't understand, that children repeat things they don't mean, but the judge's cool gaze silenced me before I even spoke. When it was my turn, I stood and tried to reclaim the story. I told the court that it had all been jokes, harmless words that were being twisted into weapons. I said David had always been too sensitive, that he had turned ordinary marriage banter into a court case. My voice rose as I insisted I was still a good mother, that Isabel needed me. But the judge interrupted, asking calmly why so many witnesses described the same pattern of cruelty. I had no answer. I mumbled that they misunderstood me, but even I heard the weakness in my defense. David's lawyer closed with a statement that chilled me. He said silence had been his client's shield, but dignity had now become his weapon. He said David had not retaliated, had not shouted, had not smeared me in public. He had simply gathered the truth and brought it to the proper place. That was why, he argued, custody and protection belonged to him. The judge announced the ruling after a short pause that felt like hours. Custody was granted primarily to David, with visitation rights for me under supervision until further review. Financial protections were enacted, ensuring David's income and assets were shielded from any future claims. The judge said explicitly that my words had caused harm, that my dismissal of them as jokes showed a lack of accountability. Each sentence stripped away another piece of the control I thought I held. I stood frozen as the gavel struck, its echo ringing like a final verdict on who I was. David rose calmly, shook his lawyer's hand, and gathered his papers. He didn't look at me, didn't gloat or smirk. His silence was absolute, and it was louder than anything I had ever said. Margaret hugged him tightly as he left. Naomi followed, her eyes flicking toward me briefly before lowering again. Michael nodded at his brother-in-law, not at me. Even my family was no longer mine. I remained in the courtroom long after it emptied, staring at the documents on the table. My lawyer murmured about appeals, about chances to change things, but his words were noise. The truth was already carved into stone. For years I had mocked David's quietness, called him spineless, called him weak. But in the end, his silence had been stronger than all my laughter, stronger than every cruel word I had thrown at him. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to humiliate me. He had let me do that to myself. and then he had collected the proof. As I walked out into the hallway, I saw David at the far end, holding Isabel's hand as she skipped beside him. They didn't see me. Or maybe they did, and simply chose not to. They walked away steadily, and he didn't look back. For the first time, I understood that my words hadn't been power at all. They had been weapons I turned on myself, until the silence I despised rose up and destroyed me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.